The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Now let's take a look at how to deficit spend responsibly. Not like these pseudo-Keynesians with constant deficit spending. That's not what I said. They want to be the man, but they're not the man. Now we're going to take a look at deficit spending responsibly. Working backwards, if we know the economic gap, as long as we use that government spending correctly, employing households, increasing their income. Infrastructure projects. So let's say we know that the gap is $400 billion. And let's go back to, let's say our MPC is 0.75. We could even do, let's say, 0.9. Let's say we know the MPC is 0.9, and don't worry, the AP test will give you the MPC. So, we plug our MPC formula in first. Let's find the multiplier. That means our government spending multiplier, also called the simple spending multiplier on the AP test, equals 1 over 1 minus MPC equals 1 over 1 minus 0.9 equals 1 over 0.1 times 10 out of 10 to make that a real number. Equals 10. What does this number 10 mean? That means we could take this gap of $400 billion below in total spending, below where we should be, from Y1 to YF, and divide it by the multiplier. We have gap. Give ourselves a little room. We have the gap divided by the multiplier, and that equals the amount the government should spend. So that means we have 400 billion divided by 10 equals, if people's MPC, marginal propensity to consume, is 0.9, is 90% of the new income that they have, the government only has to deficit spend. The government does not have to deficit spend $400 billion irresponsibly, radically increasing the debt burden. No, because remember, this is not replacing Adam Smith. This is pushing the aggregate demand in the right direction, assisting capitalism. And the government does not have to recklessly spend the full amount of the gap. If the government knows the MPC, it only has to spend a fraction of the gap, because now, if it spends $40 billion with an MPC of 0.9, that means when it spends $40 billion, if we go in reverse, 40 billion times the multiplier of 10, going around and around, and around the circular flow model. All that spending, not money, all of that spending going around and around and around the circular flow model will give you a total real GDP increase. So that initial G in AD now becomes consumer spending and income. Would give you an initial increase of $400 billion. And now we have successfully used fiscal policy, manipulated aggregate demand, chopping the economy in the right direction. shifting AD by a multiplied effect back to Space Mountain, where everybody wants to be, long run aggregate supply, where we should be. And that's how you do it. Woo! Now, one more lesson about, once this is done properly, that you could still balance a budget and still, spend exactly what you make and still improve the economy. But you don't do that during a recession. And the United States made that mistake later in 1936 and 37. And you saw unemployment spike again. So there's a time in the recession you gotta do the deficit spending. It's not the time to balance the budget. But as a little bonus, John Maynard's going to show you how to responsibly balance a budget using the government spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. And one more thing we have to add before we do that. The government spending multiplier. Let's just take a little bonus of Keynesian economics. If we take a look at the circular flow model, circular, that means the effect that government spending has if it starts in households or if it starts in businesses. In investment spending could have the same effect. So the investment spending multiplier also equals, because of the circular flow model, the product market, and the factor market, spending becomes spending, also is the same formula as the government spending multiplier. They are both the same. However, like I said, in a recession, the government should not focus on investment spending because we just came from where we should be. Investment spending was already happening. The factories are already there. The businesses aren't going to just start producing more. So you have to focus on the consumer, on shifting aggregate demand through the power and the predictability of the math of the consumer. And now for our last slide, I'm going to show you how you can balance that budget. So we got one more Keynesian economics for you. The balanced budget multiplier. How to both balance a budget, which means you spend only what you make, and still increase real GDP. First, let's take a look at the tax multiplier. The tax multiplier equals negative MPC over MPS, because taxes always imply negative. That, remember, taxes are money that is coming out of households or out of businesses, out of that spending coming out of households, out of businesses to the government. So the tax multiplier, always negative. And the reverse of that, a decrease in taxes would be a negative of a negative, which would be a positive. So should the government decrease taxes, and we're going to take a look at the balanced budget multiplier, why, of the two options, if you have to spend or decrease taxes, now while you should do both during a recession, if you have to choose one, it's government spending. So, the tax multiplier, negative MPC over MPS. Now that formula is crazy. So instead of having to memorize that formula, the way my math always works out, the always rules, is the tax multiplier is always one less and the negative of the government spending multiplier. So if the government spending multiplier is 5, tax multiplier always negative 4. If the tax multiplier is 6, government spending multiplier will always be negative 5. It's just how the math between the tax multiplier and the government spending multiplier will always work out. Now in a recession, all a combination of decreasing taxes and increasing spending. That deficit spending is what a government should do. But government spending has a greater impact than decreasing taxes. So even though a government should do both, government spending has a greater impact than decreasing taxes. The difference in multipliers, so the government spending multiplier will always be 1 greater than the tax multiplier, because people tend to incorporate government spending more into their disposable budget, into their income, versus a decrease in taxes, people tend to save more of that. As I'm not going to spend the full amount, I'm going to put some away. But with government spending, that tends to become more disposable income, which is incorporated into the monthly budget. A blanket decrease in taxes, let's say you get more money back at the end of the year in April, you might not spend all of that money right away. You might put some away from a rainy day. But government spending, if government hires you, you get a job, that money goes around and around the circular flow model, creating more jobs. As your disposable income increases, you're going to incorporate that more into your monthly budget. Not as much, a little bit. It will do this with taxes as well, but it's not as much with government spending. So the government spending multiplier is always going to be more effective than the tax multiplier. The government should do both. Decrease taxes and increase spending, create deficit spending, as I just showed you how before. You don't have to do the whole gap. You could be responsible. But government spending will always be more effective than the tax multiplier. Now, because of that disparity in multipliers, let's take a look how a government can still balance its budget, can spend what it makes. So, and the balanced budget multiplier will always equal 1. I'm going to show you what that means at the end. Let's say the government wants to spend $10 billion. In order to spend $10 billion, it wants to balance its budget, spend what it makes. So it has the tax is revenue. It first has to tax $10 billion. And let's say, for argument's sake, our MPC is still 0.9. So that means the government, let's find out our multiplier first. So we plug in our 0.9 into our formula. Negative 0.9 over MPS would be 0.1, because MPC plus MPS must always equal 1. You can either only consume or spend. You can either only spend or save, consume or save 100%. Either 90%. If you're spending 90%, that means you're saving 10%. So it must be a combination of 1. You're spending 0.9, that means you're saving 0.1. So negative 0.9 divided by negative 0.1, times that by 10 over 10 to make it a real numbers, and move that decimal space over. Negative 9 divided by 1, that means you have a tax multiplier of negative 9. What does that mean? That means that if the government collected $10 billion in taxes from households and businesses, that is money that is not going around the circular flow model, that is decreasing going around the circular flow model. So $10 billion in taxes times negative 9 equals negative $90 billion in total GDP. And this is why you can't you can't balance your budget during a recession. You cannot balance your budget during a recession, because if you're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, where is this money coming from in a recession? It's not there. Back to the balanced budget multiplier. What governments can do during regular times of peace, of no recession, of no depression. Let's say the government wants to spend $10 billion. We got the $10 billion in taxes, decrease GDP by $90 billion. Now, but the government can now spend that $10 billion. So the government spends that $10 billion, employs households, Our spending multiplier, 1 over 1 minus MPC, 1 over 1 minus 0.9 equals 1 over 0.1, times that by 10 over 10, means we have a spending multiplier of 10. That means if the government spends money, injects spending into the circular flow model, employing households, giving households new income, as households spend money, that they're going to spend money, give that money to a business. That business is going to hire someone. Now that person has more money, they're going to spend that money again, give it to a business. Their employees are going to have money, or they're going to hire people. Now those households have money in the product market again, around and around the circular flow model, tenfold, so that initial government spending to households will actually have 10 billion times 10, $100 billion impact in GDP. But that $100 billion, positive $100 billion, minus the 90 billion decrease in taxes equals a positive effect, because the government spending multiplier has a greater impact than the tax multiplier. That means that even though we earned what we spent, we still have a positive GDP impact of $10 billion. That's why the balanced budget multiplier is always equal to 1. If we tax, if we spend what we tax, that will have a 1-to-1 effect on total real GDP. And that's how you balance a budget. And before that, that's how you use Keynesian math in fiscal policy to fix an economy. Thank you for watching. I'm Professor G. Remember, whether it is your money, your mind, or your body, invest hard, invest often, and no feelings. We'll see you next time. Money never sleeps.